Hello and welcome to the latest instalment of James's Wrestling Interviews with the great and good of professional wrestling and one of the best of the 80s. I must say it is, of course, the Russian nightmare himself, Nikita Koloff. And I didn't ruin the intro. Thank goodness that's the first one. How are you doing, Nikita?
See, I told you. Hey, great to be with you. Thank you, my brother.
Thank you very much. And I'll tell you what, I'm going to just fire a load of questions at you like I do with everybody else. My eyes already darting. I don't know which way I'm looking at. But I'm actually going to ask because of recent news. And I didn't realise he actually had, I suppose, part of getting you in the business in the first place was Don Kernodle, who just recently passed. Could you tell me more about Don?
He did. And I was honored to be one of the main speakers at his celebration just recently. In fact, I was there. Sergeant Slaughter was there, who was a pallbearer for Don, and they were the best of friends, long time friends. Long before I came along, they have been friends. And the family, his brother Wally, Don had always asked me to speak at his service, when he passed. And so I feel very honored to have been a part of that. And it went really, really well. I mean, we honored him. We just celebrated his wrestling career. Like I shared that day with Sarge sitting there, Sarge and Don Kernodle get 100% of the credit for Nikita Koloff. In other words, if it wasn't for Sarge and Don, Nikita Koloff would have never been born. I would not have existed. And as the story goes, the short version, Don and Sarge were driving from, I think maybe Charleston, South Carolina to Savannah, Georgia one night after a match. And on their way to the next town, grabbed a notebook and started writing out a whole storyline for a nephew for Ivan Koloff. And they approached Jim Crockett with the idea. He loved it. He said, well, if you can find a guy. So Don then approached a guy named Road Warrior Animal. I'm sure some of your viewers, listeners may be familiar with that name.
Every single one, I'll guarantee you.
Yeah, Road Warrior Animal. And just ask this question. Do you know any big guys who wouldn't mind shaving their head and becoming a Russian? That was the question. And Animal's like, I know the guy right now. So he made a phone call to me. I made a 5-minute phone call to Jim Crockett Jr., made sure he understood I had no amateur wrestling background, no professional training, had never been in a ring. And he said he understood, told me what day to be in his office with my head shaved. I showed up the day he said to be there, which, by the way, this is way before selfies or anything like that, right? So he didn't even have a picture of me. He didn't even know what I looked like. We just had a 5-minute conversation. And I showed up the day he said to be there, and that was my introduction to Don Kernodle. That was the first day I met him and Ivan. And Nikita Koloff was born in the hallways of Charlotte in June of 1984. Him and Sarge get all the credit for the concept. They were the brainchild behind the idea. And then Don and Ivan, believe it or not, the next 2 or 3 months, because I had no experience or no training, I did actually debut on television the next night in Raleigh, Dorton Arena. Fortunately, it was only an 11-second match. But Don and Ivan would get to the towns. We get to the towns early the next 2 or 3 months. You might say I had on-the-job training because Don and Ivan would bump and thump all over the ring for me, teach me the mechanics of wrestling before the matches. And then on the way home, the three of us would talk about the old school psychology of wrestling. And that's how I learned the business. So Don and Ivan get all the credit for teaching me the business. Don and Sarge get the credit for Nikita Koloff even existing.
So did you know Don really well? Because I know he wasn't there too long before he exited the Russian group. But I suppose really the question I really want to ask is, did you ever arm wrestle him? Because I believe he was an arm wrestling champion.
Yeah, he was like 2-time arm wrestling champion. I joked at his service the other day. I said, knowing that I was never going to sit down at a table with him and arm wrestle him. I mean, he was, he was a big guy, and he put on some weight, of course, in the latter part of his years, which is part of what led to, you know, if you want to say the demise of his health. He was unfortunately overweight. That caused problems with his heart. But no, I wasn't about to arm wrestle the dude. I mean, he was like, he had like his arms were like steel cables, and I mean, yeah, there was no chance I was going to arm wrestle him.
Did you realize, because I know you weren't like a big wrestling fan at all, really, before getting into the business, did you realize Don's importance? I can't remember. It was in 1983 before the first Starrcade where he main evented with Sergeant Slaughter. Did you realize sort of like how big a part of the NWA at that time he was?
No, in fact, you know, knowing I was going to speak at his service, you know, I did a little background, and I knew we had joked over the years about his amateur career at Elon University, Elon College in those days, and what's interesting is because you know, as I guess a 7-year-old, he began dreaming of being a pro wrestler, and then when he went down to try out, he had to get in the ring with a guy named Bob Roop. Now, for those who don't know that name, Bob was on the 1968 Olympic wrestling, Greco-Roman wrestling team in Mexico City. I mean, he was, I think they call in England, a shooter, a hooker.
Yeah. Yeah.
Bob was, and as the story goes, Bob had shared with me in 2006, there's a Hall of Fame in Waterloo, Iowa, Dan Gable Museum and Hall of Fame there. He had shared with me that he remembered vividly that tryout with Don. And Don lasted longer with Bob Roop than anybody ever had. And Bob said if Don could have held in there another 30 seconds, Don would have actually defeated Roop, which was amazing. But it was that tryout that led Ole and Gene Anderson, the Minnesota Wrecking Crew, to then train Don. And of course, then he did have a storied career. I mean, he won championships in Puerto Rico. I know the TV championship, the heavyweight championship, Puerto Rico. I know he wrestled many times in Maple Leaf Garden in Toronto, the Madison Square Garden. Some legendary guys, you know, like The Rock, Dwayne Johnson's dad, Rocky Johnson, Tito Santana. He went on to win. He not only won the World Tag Team Championship with Ivan, he won it with the Sarge, and he also won it with Bob Orton Jr. So Don had a very storied career, even though it was, you know, not as highly profiled as others. He still had a great wrestling career.
And rest in peace, of course, Don. And is it Don Kernodle or Don Canoodle? How do you pronounce it?
Kernodle.
Right. Okay then.
Yep.
I'll move on from Don. And but actually, before wrestling, obviously big bodybuilder, right into it. So I've got to ask, and everyone always loves this one: heaviest bench, heaviest squat, heaviest deadlift.
So I was more, so I'll give you some answers, but just to clarify, I was more into bodybuilding, and what you just described were three of the main power moves in powerlifting, right? Deadlift. I did not like deadlifts at all. And so I very rarely even attempted a deadlift because I just didn't like them. I just didn't like them at all. And bench, believe it or not, because, and this is like, oh, he's giving it, you know, he's got it out. That's an excuse. You know, someone like myself has longer arms. You have to move that bar a further distance, right? Like we had this little guy in our gym back in the day, Ralphie. He was about 5'2", and he was about 165 pounds, bench pressed over 500 pounds. But I'm like, Ralph, you only got to move it 2 inches. That's not fair, right? Your arms are so short, you know? All that to say, I will, for the record, say my best bench press was 405 pounds. Not all that impressive, but you know, respectable, I think. Squats is where I really excelled. I mean, I love to do squats. And I just want to put it in perspective. In 9th grade, as a 15-year-old, I was squatting 550 pounds as a 15-year-old in 9th grade. And so I really excelled. I don't know if I ever then did an actual maximum beyond that, because again, I was so much more into bodybuilding that a one-off rep wasn't all that important to me. My physique was more important, in other words.
And with the chest press, I want to clarify, this is the old school, down to the chest, 1, 2, back up again.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah, it's not the. I see a lot of guys nowadays. They're benching and they're bringing the. I mean, there's about a 4 or 5 inch gap between the bar and their chest as they're doing the reps. I'm like, that ain't a real bench press. Come on, man. You got to bring it. You got to touch the chest. That's exactly right. Just to clarify, touch, pause, and go. That's a real bench press. Come on.
That's the spirit. And all you people out there, you better recognize that as well. That's a proper bench press.
That's right.
Well, you said before that Road Warrior Animal, it's Joe Laurinaitis, isn't it, that got you into wrestling, recommended you. You've got to give us some good Road Warriors Legion of Doom stories. There's got to be a few in the gym or in the wrestling ring.
Well, he was. In fact, give your audience a little more backstory on Animal. So I recruited him out of Irondale High School, New Brighton, Minnesota, to play college football with me. That was my first introduction was his accolades in the Minneapolis Star and Tribune newspaper, and I was a part of the recruiting team. And so I contacted him. Him and his mom and dad came and toured the college campus, and he signed on. And we just clicked. I mean, we had an instant connection there. We became the best of friends all through college, and I would go on to finish college, to graduate, and have my sights on playing pro football. He actually ended up dropping out of college, got married, got a job, and the next thing I know, he's on TBS on the Superstation. But we did have some fun together during those college days. I mean, we thought we were pretty boys, man. I end up with a shaved head. He ends up with a mohawk or whatever. And back in those days, though, if you've seen the old pictures, like I actually have a couple of them I just updated my latest book. It's my life story, Nikita, A Tale of the Ring and Redemption. And there's a picture of him and I in there with tuxedos and feathered hair. We thought we were such pretty boys, And then, ironically, we ended up with a shaved head and a mohawk. But I can remember back. I mean, we had so much fun on the gridiron, on the football field, and just some amazing stories there. Some things that we did, and then once I heard he got into wrestling, I went down and lived with him in Atlanta for a couple months, and just I just shadowed him, and just I was training for pro football. But it was fun to go to the arenas and hear some of the stories. He was living with Jake the Snake Roberts at the time.
God.
And then eventually when he called me, so it kind of turnabout's fair play, right? He calls me to recruit me into wrestling. And then we begin to have, a lot of people ask, how, being best friends, how are you able to have matches together, against each other without cracking up, but it's a mindset, right? You're like, this is my opponent, so you got to act like you don't know the guy, you hate the guy, right? One of the funnest memories for me, I say funnest, one of the most memorable, they did this deal where they were press slam guys, and he was strong. You asking about my strength. I don't know how many know what a seated shoulder press is. I'm talking behind the neck, old school Olympic bar, behind the neck shoulder press. I mean, he used to do that movement with 365 pounds for reps. I mean, most guys can't even bench press that, let alone sit down and press that behind your neck for reps. He was strong. And he caught me off guard one night. He caught me unattended, and he press slammed me, and he's giggling while he's holding me up, like, gotcha. Because I told him he'd never do it. I'm like, dude, you would never get me up for a press slam. So I just went like Superman. Normally you kind of put your hands on their shoulder to steady yourself. Man, I just put my arms out like Superman. I'm like, all right, big boy, I'm going to let you really impress the crowd. Well, he didn't have a problem with it. And then when he slammed me down, he kind of looked at me, winked and giggled. I go, all right, one time, but you're not getting me again. You will not get me again. But and then we had some great, just wonderful road trips. Him and I, here's who actually traveled together. Him and I, Sting and Lex Luger. The four of us traveled exclusively at one period of our careers together, the same car. We'd share hotel rooms, and and again, but yeah, just I mean, just so much fun. Animal was we had such a great relationship with each other.
Were you ever as close with Hawk?
I was not in the wrestling days. I would later, kind of the story on Hawk is we didn't really see eye to eye. I mean, it's pretty out there, what his lifestyle was like back in those wrestling days. A lot of abuse to his body and etc. through drugs and other things. And then actually in Phoenix, Arizona, a year and a half before he passed, I'd invited him and Animal to, I invited Animal invited him, and he came to a Christian conference in Phoenix, Arizona, and a pastor named Jensen Franklin was speaking, and Hawk actually responded, came down to the altar, gave his life to the Lord. We baptized him in the pool that weekend, and then I brought him on the road with me for a year and a half, mentoring him, sharing his story. He had an unbelievable story. I had no idea. They almost died 9 different times. And I would have him share that story. So the last year, a year and a half of his life, we actually became probably closer than Animal and I were. So it was a real story of redemption and story of life transformation with Hawk.
I know also that Paul Ellering, obviously the manager, where was he and you as far as friendship or just working together? Because I believe he was a powerlifter as well in his younger days.
Yeah, he was. In fact, I saw Paul at Animal's celebration last year, and still looks good. And yeah, we just had we developed a great friendship as well. I mean, I wasn't necessarily as close to him as Animal or eventually Hawk, but we had a great relationship with each other. In fact, I had a wife who passed away, as some know the story, during my wrestling days. Mandy, 24, she was diagnosed with cancer. She passed away at age 26. Prior to her passing, Paul had actually invited her and I up to his cabin up in northern Minnesota. And a favorite memory of Paul Ellering outside of the wrestling ring, he was a great manager, but outside of the wrestling ring was he took Mandy and I ice fishing in northern Minnesota. And I want to say for the record, I'm originally a Minnesota guy. So just to state for the record, I'm not from Russia, okay, and speak very little Russian. But I froze my tail off ice fishing, man. It's like, all right, I can check that box if I never do it again. And let me just tell this quick story, too. My first introduction to Paul, before I'd ever met him, was in the St. Paul Civic Center. Animal and I and a bunch of other guys were working out at a guy's gym named Jesse Ventura. You know that name?
Of course.
Jesse the Body Ventura. And Jesse was actually having a deadlift match against Paul on a wrestling card in the St. Paul Civic Center. And 25 of us muscleheads from Jesse's gym went down to watch the show. Of course, Paul was the good guy. Jesse was the bad guy. We were the bad guys because we were cheering for Jesse. And I'll never forget, we were leaving the arena, and this woman had to be, she looked like she was 90. She was probably 80. I mean, she was old. And she looked at, like, this for real story. She looked at us. She goes, you're those Jesse Ventura fans. She goes, if I had a knife, I'd stick it in his gut. I'd stick it in every one of yours as well. And I was like, whoa, some of these people take this thing pretty serious. So anyway, a couple Paul Ellering stories there.
I thought you were going to say that she was spotting one of them.
No, she was not happy that we were Ventura fans, man. And she was like serious too. I looked at my buddy because she looked right at me. She made eye contact with me. I'm like, whoa, some of these people really believe this stuff.
I'll tell you what, speaking of, not so much fans actually, but because there's only a few dozen of them in the little place, but I was hoping you'd take me back to the old TBS tapings and just take me through like a day of what time you get there, how you'd learn of the format, how many interviews backstage you might do for the whole gamut of what a day taping would be like.
Yeah, well, and I'll just, to put it in perspective for your audience, I'll broaden it just a bit. People have to. I want them to understand what our schedule potentially could be like back then. For example, in 1986, I had 454 matches. So yeah, so if you do the math on that, that's more than one a day, right? Well, TBS played into that. What I mean by that is, we did two syndicated shows called Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling and Worldwide Wrestling. So we had to tape those shows, and that was always done one night of the week somewhere, remotely, in a town somewhere. And you could easily have a couple matches that night for television, and maybe 2 or 3 interviews that night or what, right? And then TBS, we had to be in the studio at 8 a.m. on Saturday mornings. So no matter where we were on Friday night, you're either driving late into Atlanta or you're flying in late to Atlanta. So you could be at the studio by 8 a.m. And we filmed 3 hours. Because back in those days, it was a 2-hour show that went on air that Saturday night at 6:05 Eastern. And then a 1-hour show on Sunday night, I think at 7:05 or 6:05 or 7:05. So it was possible to have a couple matches on that Saturday morning while you were taping. And again, maybe another two or three interviews. And it was a small studio, but a very lively crowd. It was fun to film in. It looked bigger than life on television, but it was a very, very small crowd. And then it was often that we would leave the television tapings. We might drive to Columbus, Georgia, and have an afternoon Saturday matinee match. Come back to the Omni in Atlanta and have a show that night. Drive to Asheville, North Carolina, and have a Sunday afternoon match. And go back to Charlotte and have a Sunday night match in Charlotte. I mean, that was a typical weekend. It was pretty grueling. A lot of work.
Could you tell me more about? I mean, as I would know it, the guerrilla position. How the WWF terms it. That you have a producer, you have several people just before you go to the curtain. What would WCW be? The NWA be like? And would they be any different to the TV tapings?
Yeah, essentially, the man who pushes the pencil, in other words, what we would call the booker, typically would sit in that position. We didn't know it was that back then. I mean, we just there's a booker. He's in front of he's sitting in front of the monitors, and there's a couple other assistants or whatever, Grizzly Smith or other guys who Gene Anderson, who might cue you when it's time to go out for your match or go out for your interview and that sort of thing. And of course, a good part of my career, Dusty Rhodes was the booker. And so he essentially sat in that position. It wasn't often that I would go into that room or hang out in there. I wasn't that guy. I would just wait till it was, my time to go out and perform and do what I had to do. But yeah, it was pretty, so I guess you say different terminology back then. But nevertheless, the same kind of setup or the same format to filming. Jim Crockett Jr. typically would be there and be in that room as well, or in front of those monitors as well. So whoever's kind of running, whoever had the book, whoever's kind of running, you might say running the show. I mean, back in the days of WCW, Jim Herd and some of the other guys, would be there as well.
I will be asking about Jim Herd in a minute, but before I do, and I ask this facetiously, how was catering backstage?
How was what?
Well, there you go.
No, I knew exactly what you asked. There was no such thing as catering. Like, again, let me illustrate the picture. We were responsible essentially back in those days for pretty much anything and everything. Getting ourselves to the town, providing our own food for ourselves, like for real, legit. There was no I mean, I used to pack a cooler. The guys used to tease me, used to joke. I used to pack this red and white Igloo cooler with, all my food and Gatorade and everything that I would bring to the towns, whether it was TV tapings or anything. Every night, I just packed a cooler. A lot of guys would stop and grab something quick at a 7-Eleven or grab a quick meal in a restaurant or something. But there was no such thing as catering back in those days. You got there and all you were doing was, and it was it was 5-6 hours of TV taping. So if you didn't bring yourself something to eat, then you just didn't eat, Quite different, my brother.
Yeah. And one more thing about the TV studio where you recorded. I believe you had to share bathrooms with other companies around that were also using it, or am I just going crazy there? Am I misremembering?
Well, 10th, it's at the TBS studio, so 10th and Techwood, the TBS studio. So, there was, it was a studio. They were filming more, they'd film more than one thing in there at times, and there were different studios there in 10th and Techwood. And so, that was always a possibility. Sure.
Right, well, I'll move on, and I'm going to give you a bit of a personality test. I don't even know why I call it a personality test. It might not actually be that. But it's more of like a quick fire thing. I'm going to ask you some questions. You can plead the fifth. Quite a few people have on some of these questions. But I'll throw some stuff out here, and you tell me what you think. The funniest thing you ever saw happen on an aeroplane?
Ooh, on an airplane. Do I have to have seen it?
No.
The craziest thing on an airplane was when Uncle Ivan and the Iron Sheik, Adnan Al-Kaisi, got in a fight on an overseas flight, got in a fight on the airplane. Uncle Ivan had the bite mark from the Sheik on his neck for the rest of his life, like literally a horseshoe where Sheiki laid into him and, like a werewolf, bit him on the neck and drew blood. I never witnessed it, but when Ivan told me the story, I'm like, that's crazy. Of course, a bunch of the other boys had to break them up, and separate them. And it's an overseas flight, so it's not like they're landing, in 30 minutes. I mean, they still had hours and hours to fly. I forget where they were going, but Ivan had the proof of that fight for the rest of his life on his neck.
Wow. Last man standing at the bar.
Probably Road Warrior Hawk.
There we go. Biggest bully.
Biggest bully. Pull the most ribs, or
maybe who could have been kinder, let's say, to their fellow worker.
Biggest bully. Gosh, I didn't. Fortunately for me, I didn't experience too many on my part. I'm trying to think of who I might have witnessed.
Well, we can just move on if you like, and if you think of anything, bring it up.
We said it could plead the fifth. Come on.
Yeah, go on. I'll let you plead the fifth on that one. And obviously, you were married, I think, at the time. But if you were writing a fictional story, the town with the most eager ladies.
Oh man, you truthfully, there's you can't pick one town, for real. Back in those days, every town, and I'm not exaggerating that, every town there'd be women in every town, and or if they were smaller towns, they would drive from the bigger towns. I mean, they followed the wrestlers everywhere. So I honestly couldn't nail it down to one town. They were, like the rock and roll, like the rock and roll fan, has their groupies. Wrestling had its groupies.
Least laundered wrestler.
Define that for me.
As in the person who might wash their gear the least.
Oh, gotcha. Gosh. Well, one story that comes to mind was Blackjack Mulligan, Barry Windham's dad. He used to wear this glove. And his finishing move was the claw. So you put it on your head. And I like to say I only had you might say a handful of matches, haha, him, but it wasn't the claw that would put me out. It was the smell of the glove that would put me out. I'm like, dude, wash that glove. There's one other guy, I think, who was officially finally retired from wrestling, a lesser known name, but yet over 40 years in the business, named George South. Yeah. And I have to say, for the record, George, I don't know how many times I said, dude, go wash your gear, George.
Two fantastic answers for that one. I'll give you that one. The most dangerous situation you ever found yourself in with fans?
So 6 different times I had fans that attempted to attack me in the early days of my career, right? I mean, it was the Cold War era. People, even to this day, my brother, people until like there might be some of your audience that listens to this interview and go, what happened to his accent? I mean, I'm like, go on the internet, read my story, buy the book, Ring of Redemption. People still, I guess it's a compliment to me in the sense of how well I got my character over, that people still to this day have believed I was Russian until they either hear an interview like this or meet me in person. And so 6 different times I had people jump the barricade, come after me. Now, the very first time it happened, it caught me off guard because I wasn't expecting it. It was 1985. It was the first ever Great American Bash. I was the World Tag Champion, the World Six-Man Champion, and I'm wrestling the Nature Boy Ric Flair for the World Heavyweight title. And it's actually on film. People can go on YouTube and watch this. But I'm in the match. Flair's down on the ring. He's selling on the ring. Ivan's down on the floor. David Crockett, who's special referee, I see him. Somebody has me pinned against the ropes. I mean, it happened pretty quick. I'm like, wait a minute. Flair, Crockett, Ivan, who is this? Is something happened that they didn't tell me about? And it dawned on me. I'm like, oh my gosh, this has got to be a fan. And then the cops all rolled in, figured it out, got the guy off, arrested him, took him out. That was the first time, and that was the only time the fan would ever get a hand on me. But there were 6 different times that they came over the barricade after me, literally tried to come in the ring.
Most memorable backstage fight that you actually saw?
I don't know that I saw any. No, none come to mind. I don't know. We had, and I'll say for just this, for the record, we had a pretty good crew together that there was quite a bit of camaraderie. That's not to say that everybody got along perfectly well. And I mean, obviously you got a lot of different personalities, but that said, everyone worked really hard together. We were building the territory and so I personally didn't ever, I've heard many stories, but I personally didn't witness firsthand any of those stories.
Okay. Heaviest smoker?
Ooh, Jake the Snake Roberts, at least back in the day. and well, it might be a tie between him and Harley Race.
Fair enough. Yeah, good answers there. Best enhancement talent?
Well, in our day, we call him a jobber.
I'm very polite. I'm doing the very polite version of it.
No, I get it. I love how how the business has advanced into enhancement talent. I'm like, and guys didn't mind being called a jobber. They knew that was their job. That's why they call them a jobber, right? There were a few. I'm gonna throw a name out there I already mentioned. George South. I mean, he was very underrated, but was a great. You knew you could have a great match with George anywhere and everywhere. Never really made it, to the main event as far as a major organization. Although he's wrestled plenty of main events, George South.
I'll give you this one. Magnum TA once described you as devastating a human being as you could ever step in the ring with. So, so as far as the jobbers, let's call them the jobbers, you must have caught a couple of them a bit too hard with the sickle one time or another. Do you remember any that come to mind?
Well, they at least lived to talk about it. So Magnum and I, we just did recently. We called it Road Stories. We had a church in Kentucky recently brought him and I and a wrestler named Lodi from Ravens Flock from the mid late '90s, and we did a Road Stories in this church up in Kentucky. And Magnum and I were joking about especially our Best of 7 series, but our styles of wrestling. Where some would term us as stiff, we preferred to say we were, again, terminology, right? We preferred to say we worked snug. And so that's why I think the chemistry between the two of us and our matches lined up so well, was just because of our similar styles. And probably the best to memory, the one who made the Russian sickle, which, by the way, there's a lot of clotheslines. There's only one Russian sickle, right? But probably the one who personified it the best was, there were 2 brothers named the Mulkey brothers.
Yes.
The Mulkeys. And man, Randy Mulkey, I think he cut about a 450 flip, way before AJ Styles, from the Russian sickle. Of course, the other one I'll mention real quick because he experienced it. He was willing, but he didn't know when it was coming. Would have been when I sickled David Crockett. He felt that one, but he lived to talk about it.
Which is a shame, because I think a lot of people would have liked him off commentary at that time.
I know he wasn't a fan favorite when it came to commentary. Many of the fans say it was just too one-sided, but that was David Crockett.
I should say people weren't disappointed that you didn't kill him. I'm saying that he could carry on talking afterwards, is what I'm trying to get at.
Right. No, I know what you mean.
I'll tell you what, right? We're going to move on a tiny bit then, and I'm going to bring up Khrushchev. So I know him best because, we didn't get NWA over here, so anything I've watched is, retroactive pretty much when I was an adult. So I know him best as Demolition Smash. And I believe that you've said before that the one time you were considering going to the WWF was, in fact, you tell me.
Well, and I get asked all the time, did they ever try to contact me? Did I ever? I met Vince McMahon in a gym in Las Vegas before the Monday Night Wars. We were running head to head in towns, and we just happened to Vegas and had a very cordial conversation. Had nothing to do with business, and we just moved on. And then Barry, we brought him in as Crusher Khrushchev, which, by the way, he and I went to high school together, so we know each other a long, long time. He graduated high school 1 year after me, and so we had the Crusher Khrushchev thing going. And then he told me he was going to move on to WWF at the time and be Demolition. And he had mentioned to me, he goes, would you consider going with me? We'll be, and he kind of illustrated, the story, the tag team, what that personified, what that looked like. And in my mind, I thought 2 things. One, I've worked really, really hard on the Russian character, right, to get the Russian Nightmare over and get that character over. So I really wasn't interested in going and changing characters as hard as I'd worked on it. And then secondly, out of respect for the Road Warriors, I really just didn't want to take on that persona, in a sense, out of respect for the Road Warriors. And so, so that is he and I did talk about it, and then, but he still went. I just respectfully declined. He still went, got Bill Eadie, and the rest is history, right?
Yeah. Do you remember this time in around 85, 86, this time, AWA, Mid-South, did anyone else try and lure you away at that time?
No, I've been, essentially, I like to say to this day, loyal to the NWA, through and through, for NWA loyal forever. I did work. Obviously, I did some things with the AWA. with the Gagnes and some title matches against Zbyszko, Larry Zbyszko, and etc. But at the time, Crockett and Gagne were doing some co-promotions together. Again, battling against Vince McMahon. Like, we did a number of co-promotion shows up in the Meadowlands in New Jersey. And that really, as a favor to Vern and to the AWA, I came in and did some television tapings. I did a few house shows for them. It wasn't so much that I was interested in jumping to the AWA or negotiating a contract with the AWA. It was more just trying to help them out, knowing that we had done some co-promotions with them and hopefully extending their product.
Well, since you brought up the AWA, I'll actually jump forward to 89. So you've hinted at it before, and people can look for the story, but you had some personal tragedies. That's why you left wrestling in 88. And then instead of going to the NWA, you went to the AWA for about a month and did some TV tapings. Is this the period you're talking about, or is this the Pro Wrestling USA period you're talking about before?
Well, it's kind of a combination. So we did the Pro Wrestling USA, but because we were doing some of those co-promotions, I was willing to go up to AWA and try to help them boost their ratings, boost their shows, and which is why I went. So kind of tied in together. Again, it wasn't like I was looking to just be predominantly an AWA guy.
Yeah, I've spoken to Larry Zbyszko a couple of months ago and, thoroughly enjoyed him. How did you feel he was? I mean, did you do the whole stalling for 48,000 minutes before actually touching thing?
Yeah, Larry's one of the best at when it comes to stalling. Him and George South were two of the best at taking 10 minutes to take off their ring jacket before the bell even rang. In fact, Larry could be let's throw Larry into that chain smoker category as well with Harley and with Jake the Snake. But no, I loved working with Larry, man. I thought he was great to work with. He was so much fun and had just such a great mind for the business. And what your audience needs to understand is back in those days, we had a predetermined outcome, but when we stepped in the ring, for the most part, you wrestle a guy like Zbyszko or I wrestle a guy like Ric Flair. I mean, we're not handed any script. We're writing our own script as we go, spontaneously in the ring, drawing the fan into the story. And so that was fun to work with Larry.
You worked with Ric Flair on the main event of some pretty big shows. I'm going to bring up Starrcade 86, but it's not going to be the question you think. The semi-main event, the scaffold match between the Road Warriors and the Midnight Express. Were you watching that in the back when Jim Cornette?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I thought to myself, I thought those guys were crazy. I'm like, I went with the first time they set that scaffold up, I went down to the ring and I was looking at that thing. I'm like, there's no amount of money in the world to get me on that thing. Don't even ask. Because I'm like, that's crazy. Of course, evidence of that would be when Jim Cornette did the drop and basically busted both his knees. And I guess Ray Traylor, was supposed to be there to catch him, but I'm like, really? I'm like, I know Ray's a big guy, but he's supposed to catch Jim Cornette. Okay, whatever. So yeah, I think all of us were watching it with anticipation to see exactly what was going to happen. And of course, in a sense, you might say we weren't disappointed. I mean, the fans got a good show.
Yeah, but they got the money's worth. Do you remember him getting sort of carried through the back when you were sort of getting prepared?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, it was memorable.
Well, speaking of memorable, I was hoping for some general Jim Cornette memories. What was he like backstage in the mid-'80s? Because I remember I wasn't even born then. I remember stories of the very early 80s and late 70s where Jim would talk about, before he was even a manager, where he'd say, God, if he can get so much heat with the boys when he's not even wrestling or managing or anything, think how great he'd be in front of the cameras.
Well, Jim Cornette's one of a kind. I mean, his personality is what it is, even to this day. And I don't know that he's really any different or much different present day than he was back then. He did have a tendency, he was a manager and and was proficient at running his mouth, whether he was in front of a camera or behind the scenes in a dressing room. And much to his credit, I will say this: he always had a great mind for the business, had some very creative ideas. So he really did fit into the wrestling role very, very well. And I think one of my one memory about Jim, it was in a transition time when, the rumors were flying around that Jim Crockett Promotions was maybe going to close its doors. They had run into some financial difficulties. I just remember being in Savannah, Georgia, and Crockett had called all of the guys on the show back, into this big room in back to kind of inform them of, if you want to say, kind of give a State of the Union. And I remember Cornette jumping up on this big table and just kind of sharing his thoughts, and in a sense, you might say, just putting it out there for the boys. So even though he at times might have had heat with some of the guys, I really gained a lot of respect for Jim that day to really stand up. And I don't remember exactly what he said, but just the fact that he was willing to say something where the rest of us were just kind of looking around, like, oh man, what are we going to do? So it's a memory of Jim Cornette.
Well, I'll tell you what then. I'll actually go straight to there, because I was going to ask you, what are your memories of when the NWA, or Jim Crockett Promotions more specifically, do you remember when it started faltering? Because as far as I can gather, audience was still there, tickets were still being sold, but there was sort of financial mismanagement. Do you remember the first time you sort of learned of that, and maybe things weren't going quite as well as they should have been?
Well, the Savannah, Georgia story I just told you was kind of really the rumors were flying around. So I guess Crockett had to kind of, say again, give the State of the Union. Essentially, the way I understand it, what happened is, Jim Crockett was a mom and pop organization. It was run by the Crockett family for 50 plus years. And we exploded. I mean, business exploded, and it was growing fast. And Crockett had purchased a Gulfstream plane, a private plane. Then he purchased a Falcon jet. Instead of flying commercial, we started flying privately, which we loved. I mean, hey, you don't have to go to a commercial airport and go through, all the rigmaroles of checking bags. You just roll up onto the tarmac, hand your bag to the pilot, and he throws it on the plane, and you park your car and walk up on the plane, without a ticket. I mean, we loved it, right? I mean, it was great. But I think that was part of the problem was Crockett was overspending. I mean, the purchase of 2 private planes, it comes at a hefty price, right? Having pilots on payroll, on full-time payroll, even though they're not flying every day, is a price, right? So I think what happened, the way I understand it, is there was overspending, and then the guy that was doing their books, the bookkeeper, I think his name was Dave. I don't remember for sure, but he was used to running a small organization, and when millions and millions of dollars started flowing in, it was months that went by. I mean, it was 6, 7, 8, 9 months that went by before they really realized we're no longer in the black, we're in the red because of overspending. And it was almost like, how do we dig ourselves out of this hole? And of course, as many know, the result of which was he sold the company to Ted Turner.
Well, when he did sell this company to Ted Turner, I believe that was October 1988. What major changes did you see backstage?
Man, it went from a family-owned business to corporate America. Let's just start with that. It went from walking out of your office and into another and having a conversation to Dusty telling me one time he couldn't even have a conversation with the guy in the office next to him. He'd have to send an email so to be documented in case there was any misunderstanding of communication. I'm like, so every conversation has to be documented? I'm like, dude, that's crazy, right? But it was corporate America. they started levying fines and started setting times that you had to be at the building. And if you weren't, then you were going to be fined $1,000 or whatever. You know, they had the goons there looking. If you're supposed to be there at 7:30 and you got there at 7:31, they'd send your name in. And so in my view, personally, they started really taking the fun out of it. Now, for the record, I then began to like less and less the business from that aspect outside of the ring. I still love getting in the ring and entertaining the fans, but all of the politics outside of the ring just took the majority of fun for me away from it. And I mean, the tensions just got a little higher. Now you got road agents are kind of watching you like a hawk. The 6-man, I think it was in Norfolk, Virginia, they fined me $1,000. And Bill Watts at this point had the book, Cowboy Bill Watts. And I went right to Watts and I go, hey, what the heck? What's this for? What the heck? He goes, well, it was reported that you guys were lazy in your match and you didn't give people, a top performance. I go, well, that's a bunch of that's gar. I go, who reported that? So he said who the agent was, and I said, I want the agent and you in a room along with the rest of us. I want to hear from his mouth that he witnessed that. Well, long and short of the story is it turns out he didn't witness it. He was off doing something else. Somebody else at the show that night told him that, and so he just wrote it up and reported. All that to say, I got the $1,000 fine for all of us rescinded. And so it's just things like that you're like, wow, man, really? So anyway, those are a few of the stories.
Well, I mean, we can't also go to the sale of Ted Turner without the installation of Jim Herd as the head booker. Any stories about Jim Herd?
Pizza Man.
The Pizza Man.
The Pizza Man. Yeah. Yeah, Jim qualified to run a wrestling company because he ran a TV station that aired wrestling in the 1960s. So certainly that qualifies you to run a wrestling company. I mean, for sure. Again, the change of corporate America. So Ted Turner loved wrestling, but he wasn't going to run the wrestling company. He hired guys, right? I'll just say this. It was what they say in the South and maybe other places. Maybe this happens for you over there in England. It was the good old boy system. So if you're in the inner circle, if you're part of the good old boys club, you can get a job whether you qualify for it or not. And so Jim was a friend of one of the guys, one of the executives overseeing World Championship Wrestling, which was just a portfolio in Turner's financial empire, right? It was just one of his many businesses. And so I would scratch my head many times in decisions that Jim Herd would make. I just couldn't wrap my head around it. I'm like, this makes zero sense. This makes no sense, but I'm not the boss. Okay.
Do you remember if he ever tried to sort of adjust your character in wrestling, like the old story with Ric Flair where he tried to get him to shave his head and call him Spartacus? Did he ever try and get you to grow your hair out and call you I don't know what?
No, he did not. I just kept my distance from Jim. And now I did grow my hair out, but it wasn't because of Jim Herd. It was actually kind of was modeling kind of when Rocky IV came out, and that's a whole nother story for another time. You know, Dolph Lundgren and I screen tested for Rocky IV. Lundgren got the role. I was just too big for the role. I mean, I was 285 pounds, and Stallone's 165. You know, with dripping wet, and so it was just I just overshadowed him for real. Anyway, and when that movie came out, and I looked at Lundgren's haircut in the movie, I thought, that's kind of a cool Russian look. So that's why I did a short stint with the hair. And looking back, I'm like, that was great. I should have just kept the bald. But anyway, I gave it a shot.
So the final thing I do with this podcast, I call it the firing line, and I'm going to fire at you some names. So it's sort of like the personality test. I'm going to give you some names. and I'm sure you're going to say, they're all cool people and everything, but if you've got a funny story to
First
throw
thing
in,
that comes to mind, huh?
yeah, first thing that comes to mind, but if you've got a funny story to throw in with them, please do. And the first one is Wahoo McDaniel.
Wahoo McDaniel. Yeah, say what you want about wrestling. His chops were real. And there were many times they had a little more than one handprint on my chest from the chief. He was a couple memories about Wahoo. He was at, of course, the latter part of his career, and it was always every night before the match. He had kind of this jet black hair, but it was, as happens with age, it was thinning. It was getting thinner. And so I don't even know what it was, but he always had this can of spray that he would spray on his head. It wasn't hairspray. It was like some kind of coloring to fill it in to make his hair look fuller, to make it look like he had more full head of hair. And it's, you didn't always, you had to catch him in the right mood if you wanted to tease him with something. So every now and then we could joke with him about that. But that was one memory. But the best memory with Wahoo is he was the national heavyweight champion. I was the United States heavyweight champion. We were going to unify those two belts. And he was gracious enough to get in the ring and put me over and unify those belts, where I walked away with both of those titles on that night. And so, pretty amazing. And the whole nickname Wahoo, he had a pro football career prior to wrestling, and he actually got that nickname prior to wrestling from in the whole stadiums. When he played defense and he'd make a tackle, and the announcer would say, who was in on the tackle? Guess who? And they'd all go, Wahoo! I mean, 50,000 people. So anyway, he was a great heel. He was a great fan favorite, and just nothing but great memories about Wahoo McDaniel.
Now, some of these names are going to be a bit more random here. So, Dark Journey.
Okay. Who?
Dark Journey.
Oh, Journey. I vaguely remember her as a valet, I believe, for Tully Blanchard. If I remember, that's my memory of Dark Journey, as a valet for Tully Blanchard. And seem to remember, I mean, she was a good fit for Tully. I mean, as far as like the character and the storylines and what they were telling at that point in time. And the gals back then were, for the most part, kind of used in a different role than they are today, right? The divas of today or whatever. So she was a trendsetter, you might say. She preceded the divas of today and did well.
Jackie Crockett.
What? Jackie was a character. I'll tell you what. He was a jokester. I mean, he could crack. He always had a joke he would crack, and a great cameraman, and always very supportive of what I did, and even has some great ideas back then. Like when Ivan and I did the dungeon scenes, he was very helpful and illustrating those dungeon scenes and getting the story across for that first match against Ric Flair.
Buzz Sawyer.
Buzz Sawyer. I only knew Buzz because of the couple months that I lived with Animal down in Atlanta, and he just seemed like instead of Buzz Sawyer, it should have been Buzzsaw. I mean, he had a unique personality, and his ring name certainly fit him. He was a Buzzsaw.
Buddy Landell.
Buddy Landell.
See, there's always a good story when it's say the name and you just can't stop laughing about it.
Man, Buddy was crazy. I think he should have been tested, like, legit. There was one time I rode with Buddy to a town. I remember we were leaving Charlotte, and it was back in the days. I mean, he's weaving in and out of traffic. It doesn't seem like he's really even paying attention to the road. And I don't remember why it came up or how it came up, but from underneath his seat, he pulls out like this 357 Magnum or something. I mean, and I'm like, dude, what's what I mean, this was before. I mean, I don't know how carried, conceal, and all that works over there, or even how it did in America at the time. But I'm like, I just did that. I was not expecting that. I was not expecting him to pull a gun from out underneath the seat, nor did I know what he intended to do with it. And I'm like, what are you doing? And he was just like, never know when you got to protect yourself. And I'm like, for real? I'm like, anyway, so yeah, and he drove so crazy. By the time I got home from that show, I vowed to never ride again in a car with Buddy Landell because I valued my life for many reasons.
El Gigante.
Elegante. I don't know that I ever got in the ring with him. I might have. It's interesting. I see all these different. Like I saw somebody put a clip on social media the other day for, Tracy Smothers giving me his kick or whatever, and I don't remember. So you're in the ring with a lot of guys. I do vaguely think I had like maybe a 6-man tag match. He was a big dude. I mean, obviously he wasn't as bulky as Andre the Giant, but he was definitely a giant of a man.
Baby doll.
Baby doll, Nicola. Man, she was perfect for what she did. She really was. Whether she was again at Tully's side or eventually at Dusty's side. In fact, there's a clip. A lot of times when I go and speak in churches and different opportunities I have to speak, I got this little 60-second opening clip, and it was Dusty, Magnum, and Baby Doll in the ring, and I'd already hit Magnum with the sickle, and Uncle Ivan was holding Baby Doll, and it was like I was going to hit her with my Russian sickle, and Dusty like shoves her out of the way, and he gets hit with the Russian sickle, and that begins an angle with Dusty and I against each other, and but yeah, Nicola was great. What on either side?
Cowboy Lang or Lord Littlebrook, either one.
We cry every summer. Those guys, man, they were. I just want to say they were fun to watch. Oh my gosh, and they were pretty cut-ups in the dressing room too. Funny guys, and we always had the midgets on our shows in the summer. And the reason Crockett would put the midgets and women on the card in the summers because that was the time in those days when we drew the least crowds. Because for whatever reason, during the school year, we always drew better crowds. So in the summertime, Crockett would bring in those specialty matches to try to draw bigger crowds, and those guys were so fun to watch.
Manny Fernandez.
The Raging Bull. He would be one. Remember I said earlier that, we had great camaraderie among all the guys, and we did. And I tried the best, to really I feel get along with everybody. Although, again, there are personality clashes. And I would say Manny was one that for whatever reason, our personalities clashed. That's not to say we didn't get in the ring and, still have a decent match, but he would have been one that I didn't necessarily look forward to wrestling in a single match. Now, tag match, obviously a little bit easier because you can tag in and out. But we just didn't line up, our personalities and nothing personal against them. We just didn't line up well in our personalities.
A few more. Pistol Pez Watley.
Pistol Pez, Shaska too, right? I think you wrestled Shaska. I remember a handful of matches against Pez, and great worker from what I recall, from what I remember, and always willing to just to get the best outcome for the match, and so always willing to work with whoever he was working with, from what I remember.
Sid Vicious.
Sid. Woo! There are certain guys in wrestling that had a known reputation for being, I'll use I'll use the word reckless. And you know, Sid was he was a big guy, a very physical guy. And, you know, you just had really, honestly, my experience had to be on guard and just make sure, you know, I was protecting myself, you know, when I stepped in the ring with Sid.
I take it you never played softball with him then?
I did not play.
And one to finish off, and it's a good one, Lex Luger.
The total package, Lex Luger. My best friend, my best friend. And it's interesting looking back in the day, back to the, you know, when we had that first match in Greensboro in the cage, when, you know, I dropped the U.S. title to him. Later on, you know, presenting him with a new belt in Phoenix, Arizona, hitting him upside the head with the belt to start an angle back in the day. I felt like, again, like Magnum, I felt, because obviously our body styles measured up pretty well, and I felt we had some pretty decent matches. I would say even back in the day when many thought he was, by his own admission, you know, pretty arrogant, almost you might say a narcissist of sorts, that I was one of the few guys I joke and say I actually liked him back in those days. I mean, we traveled together, drove together, sometimes just him and I to towns. And I would last see him when I left wrestling in 1993. I saw him in December of 95, and then didn't see him again for 11 more years. But ironically, once again in Phoenix, Arizona, we were reunited at that same Christian conference where Road Warrior Hawk gave his life to Jesus. Lex and I were reunited out there at that same conference, and that began a lifetime now friendship where he and I mean, we've done a ton of ministry together. In fact, the shirt I'm wearing today says Man Camp. Him and I co-facilitate a camp every spring and every fall for men. And tag team, if you will, for this Man Camp. And just, in fact, he lived with me for 10 months in 2015. That's where this camp was birthed out of, from that time he was living with me. And my biggest inspiration, and what I mean by that, for those who don't know his story of his spinal cord injury, how he lost 100 pounds, to date, that happened in about 2007, and to date, I have never once heard him complain about his injury, and we go to the gym together. He's been my biggest inspiration, because I feel like, you know, here's a guy who's predominantly in a wheelchair, although he can walk and lost 100 pounds, that if he can do that, and knowing what he's gone through and still have the positive attitude that he can, and be an inspiration for so many others, then clearly he's one of my biggest inspirations. I'm grateful that the Lord reconnected Lex and I, and now we have become the best of friends.
I'll ask a couple more on Lex Luger, and then I'll shut this down. And one of them is, you mentioned before how, like, he was a bit difficult to get on with. Why? What specifically?
Well, again, I mean, he'll tell you it was his world, and you were just living in it. I mean, for example, he used to call it flex time, and meaning he was never on time. Like, I don't think ever. And you know, guys would get mad at him for, you know, they'd be waiting for whatever, 15, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever. But he'd like joke and say, it's flex time. But it was his world. And when I say, you know, he was pretty arrogant, I mean, he was. It was all about him. It was all about Lex. And if you didn't like it, oh well, you know, too bad. And I remember one time he really got reprimanded by another mentor of his, a guy named Doc Frady, who had been a pastor for over 50 years prior to his passing. But Lex, when he gave his life to the Lord in 2006, April 23rd, he began to go to Doc Frady's Bible study, and he'd show up late all the time. And like Doc pulled him aside one time and he goes, Lex, can I talk to you for a minute? He's like, sure. He goes, I noticed you're always like, consistently like 10 minutes late. And he's like, oh yeah, it's flex time. Ha ha ha. And he goes, let me tell you something. He goes, you see those 6 guys sitting there around that table? You weren't 10 minutes late. You were 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, and 70. You're 70. You see, our 10 minutes is just as important as your 10 minutes, Lex. And so you're what you're saying to us is you have no respect for us and no respect for time. And he was like a deer in the headlights, like, whoa. And so last part of that story is he shows up at Doc's church the next Sunday night, 30 minutes early, think he's going to build some brownie points. And he walks in with his hat and his Starbucks coffee. And he's like, Doc, I'm 30 minutes early. Does that count for something? Doc turns around, looks at him. He goes, Lex, he goes, walk out of the sanctuary, take your coffee out of the sanctuary and take that hat off. He's like, oh my gosh, I can't win with Doc. But he loved Doc for 80. And he really gained a respect for time and for other people. And I don't know that he's ever been late from that conversation to anything else ever.
I've had one final one to ask, and I might sneak one more in, but I've got to ask this. Giants, I believe, and I've been told the story recently in WWE, the Great Khali and the Big Show, they had bad feelings towards one another purely because they were giants. Did you ever have any specific competition with any other bodybuilders because you were looking at them and thinking, they're my competition?
I didn't personally, or at least not that I was aware of, my brother. I mean, there was if you want to say, it wasn't so much with bodybuilders because of the way I broke into wrestling with no training, no background, and had this, what you might say, this meteoric rise in wrestling. There was a level, I sensed a level of jealousy just overall. So not so much with another big guy as much as just the way I broke into the business. And Ivan was very, very gracious to pull me aside more than once to say, don't let that bother you. You paid your dues in the gym and on a football field. You paid your dues other ways. You haven't spent, 5, 6, 7 years, in small arenas trying to perfect your craft, but you paid your dues. And so I knew there was animosity and if you want to say some jealousy, in that regard. But overall, I just didn't sense any from other bodybuilder or other muscular guys or big guys.
And you were a better bodybuilder. You could lift more than Lex, couldn't you?
I don't know, man. That might have been a good one for people to put a bet on. Who can lift more, Lex Luger or Nikita Koloff? That might have been a good one to wager a bet on right there.
All right, and your fellow Manchester United fan as well. But I'll tell you what, for now, we've gone well over an hour already, so thank you so much for joining. And I'm actually looking at the right camera as well, so I've done the intro flawlessly. I'll do the outro pretty good as well. Thank you very much for joining for Nikita Koloff. Myself, James. We'll catch you next time.